Welcome to the Today Counts show. Today does count because it impacts, it influences your tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. The Today Counts podcast is sponsored by the generous donors of the Lead Today community. I'm your host, Kim Piper. Everybody, on our show today, we have Peter Young, quite a colorful story that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about basketball. We're going to talk about other dreams that sometimes don't come true. We're talking about some books that he has written or in the process of writing. We're going to talk about tragedy, really. I think you can call that, all surrounded about how Peter got wrapped up in a cult. So this is going to be pretty interesting. Peter, welcome to the show.
Jim, thanks for having me.
Hey, I want to start off with this whole thing that we talked about before I hit the record button. So you had a dream. You said that your dream was to play professional basketball and be the next Larry Bird. For those who don't know, Larry Bird is a Hall of Fame retired basketball player for the Boston Celtics. He and Magic Johnson went at it for years, along with some other drama and stories. So, I mean, to say that someone's going to be the next Larry Bird is like saying that I'm going to be the next chairman of the board of Bank of America. It's a pretty lofty. You must have been a pretty good basketball player, Peter, to believe that.
Well, either that or I had a pretty big ego. I think it was a little bit of both for sure. So I grew up in the 80s, when Bird was a star and I was convinced I was going to be, his teammate for the Celtics and played basketball in college. And then to continue, the Reader's Digest version of me. So obviously I wasn't that good. And then when I got done playing in college, I got into coaching and I was going to be the next John Wooden, which is the great coach for the UCLA Bruins. That didn't happen either. So then I was going to be the next Bob Costas of sports broadcasting, and that didn't happen either. So I think finally when I got into my 40s, the Lord humbled me, and I needed to learn that lesson that I don't need to be the next anybody else, just me.
Yeah. What position did you play?
So I was the classic tweener, right? Not big enough to be an effective forward on the inside, not quick enough to be a good guard. So I was a 3, the small forward. So I could shoot. And the famous story that I love to tell is Red Auerbach, the great coach and general manager for the Celtics, played at George Washington University like in the 40s. That's where I played. It's right in D.C. And he always had a house in D.C. for all those years he was coaching at the Celtics. And he would come to 1 or 2 of our games or practices a year. And the first time I ever met him, I'd never met the guy. And I'm walking into the gym to go to practice. And there's my head coach and Red Auerbach. They just got done playing racquetball. And Red's got an unlit cigar. And his coach says, my coach says, Peter, this is Red Auerbach. Red, this is Peter Young. And Red doesn't say, hi, how are you? Nice to meet you. He just says, Young, you can shoot, but you can't do nothing else. And that's the only time I ever talked to the guy. That's it.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Red because when I had my little stint at coaching basketball, I must have had a stack of about a dozen VHS tapes where he is coaching and teaching, basketball. So I would memorize that. I would, watch that and try to bring that in my own practices. So I bet you today you still have a good jump shot. I mean, how old are you now?
I am 55, and the last time I was playing pickup basketball, I actually fractured my ankle, and that was about 4 months ago. So I'm in rehab. I'll get back out there, but I'm the slow old guy now.
Yeah, I think most basketball injuries happen on the recreational court in the weekend warrior situation. I have a fake right shoulder because of a collision on the recreational basketball court. So I feel you. Now you said you played basketball in college. Where'd you play?
Played at George Washington University in Washington, D.C.
Oh, you mentioned that. Yeah. George. Okay. Well, that was a good time though. Good memories, I'm sure, for that. And
loved it. Loved my time in college. We weren't very good. I wasn't very good. I did have a few good games that, I can hang my hat on and say I could play at that level. And that was the basis for my first book that I ever wrote called The Blue Team. The Blue Team is about faith in basketball. And the idea is that, your adversary for a basketball player is not the guy trying to block your shot or the teammate who won't pass you the ball or the coach who won't play you. It's your own mind. So when the Lord saves us, he saves us from ourselves. So the battle is really in the mind, and that's where it's first won or lost. And so the blue team is fiction. And I always say it's fiction because the team and the main character are really good. So, and I wasn't. But that was the backdrop for my first book.
Yeah. So life goes on, and you get married and have kids. You draw a bridge, create a bridge for me from basketball, George Washington, to finding a girl and getting married and doing all that stuff.
Sure. So got done with my 5th year at GW. We were pretty good. We made the NIT. We had a good team. Then I moved out west, kind of fulfilled a dream. I just fell in love with the West, bought an old station wagon, packed it up, drove out to Colorado. And then that's where I got into coaching. I had a good friend named Sharm Sherman who used to coach at the University of Iowa and coached for many years with Athletes in Action. It's a Christian organization that sponsors
used
teams.
to wrestle for him.
Oh, really? Yep. Yeah. So I traveled overseas in 88 and 89 with Athletes in Action. So then Sharm helped me. I got an assistant job at the University of Colorado in Boulder. And the next year I was at Golden High School. Then I was flat broke. And so I decided, well, I'm going to do something else. And I got into sports broadcasting. And my first job was in little old Pocatello, Idaho in 1995. A year later, I met my future wife. It's a fascinating story. And the few months surrounding that meeting are, again, fascinating, are chronicled in the book. We got married in 97.
And then you had a ton of kids.
Yeah, we had 5. We did. Well, the funny thing is, we got married and 10 months later, we had our first.
Okay. So, all right. So you're married, you're having kids, and if I'm following this right, you're now in Idaho, and go ahead, continue the story. I want to hear about this idea where you got involved in a cult. Is that right?
Sure. So I call her Paige in my book. My book is the memoir, Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger. It's not a real name, but that's what I call her in the book. So, I had dated off and on, but, I was 28, I think at the time. I thought, well, I thought I'd be married by now. And I had seen this tall, beautiful blonde woman around the campus of Idaho State University and Pocatello. I hadn't met her yet, but, 6 foot tall, statuesque looking, blonde hair, gorgeous. And I remember telling a buddy of mine, we were at the gym working out, and I described her, didn't even know her name. And he said, oh, I know who that is. And he told me her name and her sister's name because they were roommates. And, oh, by the way, they have this really weird family guru. And so before I ever even met Paige, I'd heard about the weird family guru. So about a few weeks later, I meet her at a singles Bible study, which is kind of why you go to those things, right? So we met. Boy, we started dating, a few weeks after that. And I was 90% sure I wanted to marry her, Jim, after about 10 days of dating. But the other 10%, if you will, of hesitation was I needed to meet her father and her uncle Robert because she talked about him all the time. And on our first date, I gathered the weird family guru, and I didn't tell that to her, was this Uncle Robert guy. So I met the father about a month later around Thanksgiving, met Uncle Robert a few months later. And, I was wrong, but at the time I thought, well, he's a little odd and eccentric, but largely harmless. And of course, that proved to not be the case. And again, so that was 1997. So we got married 9 months after we met. And again, 10 months after that, we had our first child. But if I can kind of, give the really fascinating part to all this is where the title of the book comes in, is that right before Paige met me, she had been baptized. And when you get baptized, you publicly profess your faith. But Uncle Robert, who had always been around her entire life, was not an uncle, not related at all. Short, bald guy from Syria who got to know Paige's parents before Paige was even born. So she grew up in a world where he was always the expert on everything. And her parents would have been brainwashed for decades. She gets baptized without him. And then just living a life on her own. She's graduated from college. She's got 2 master's degrees. She had gone on dates. And meanwhile, Uncle Robert's in Southern California. She's in Pocatello. And then she has a dream. And in the dream, there's a tiger that is going to kill her if it finds her. She's in a house with a boyfriend at the time named Chad and her mom. And she doesn't want to kill the tiger. She just wants to know where it is so she can stay safe. Because she respects the tiger for its strength and courage and beauty and intellect, etc. There are qualities she admires about the tiger. So just wants to know where it is to kind of control it. And then the door opens and in walks a tall man. And the tall man is there to get rid of the tiger. So she hides, the boyfriend disappears. And eventually the tall man gets rid of the tiger. So I don't know how many times she had this dream, found it disturbing. She writes her interpretation, sends it off to Uncle Robert. And then he writes the interpretation of this letter, of this dream. It's like 23 pages long, and sends it to her. She probably got it a day or two after we met. So in his interpretation of the dream, he's the tall man, even though he's like 5'6". He's a little short guy. And the tiger in the dream would have been Paige's ego, her mind. You know, Paul talks about being saved from our old man, the old ego. So in essence saying, I'm the hero, Uncle Robert is the hero, and you, Paige, are not a Christian. So he took the dream, I believe, completely turned it upside down to what it really meant, which was a warning for her that this man she admired was not who he says he was, and convinced her she wasn't a Christian. And so then she became the first in our little cult who, had their kind of faith turned upside down and had to be, quote unquote, saved by Uncle Robert. And that was 1990. That would have been 1996. And of course, the obvious interpretation of the dream, that I didn't really recognize at the time, because I'm like, I'm not here to save anybody, but I'm 6'5". And the reason she couldn't see the face of the tall man in the dream, and she pointed that out, she could not see the face of the tall man, it's because she hadn't met me yet. She had the dream right before she met me. So instead of me coming into her life and being able to warn her, maybe rescue her, but maybe not, about this man that she has elevated into like a godlike position, Uncle Robert, that he's a fraud. Instead, he turns it upside down and now has even more control over her. And then that led to a couple years later where Paige's parents were, convinced by Uncle Robert that they were demonic frauds, liars, not Christians. And then 15 years later, happened to me.
And was this like a gathering of people, like a typical church service? And what made this thing, Peter, a cult?
Well, I always say that cults come in all shapes and sizes, but at their core, cults are undue mind control, manipulative, coercive, dangerous, damaging mind control. So we didn't look like large cults. We were small. We didn't live in a commune. There was no sexual abuse, physical violence. We didn't shave our heads, wear weird clothing, recite chants, etc. But we figuratively drank the Kool-Aid, which was all the ideas of Uncle Robert, whose real name is Robert Booty. Again, he lived in Southern California. He met Paige's parents at a tiny seminary in Fresno, late 60s, early 70s, before Paige was born, and then got to know them, Jack and Kathy back then, and maintained this very dominant, unhealthy relationship for all those years. So then when I, kind of unwittingly joined all this, when I married Paige, and I knew that this guy was odd, right? Like I wasn't blind to it. We had many discussions about it before we got married. We would just talk to him on the phone. So I didn't, but, Paige would talk to him on her cell phone. Her parents would talk to him all the time. And then he would travel up to Idaho. We would gather at my in-laws and we would have these conferences where we would sit in a semicircle around him in the living room and listen to him talk for hours on end.
Now, Peter, you seem like a bright person to me. You're an athlete. You're a competitor. I'm trying to figure out what wooed you into that. Was it simply the community, being with Paige and the family, so you just kind of went along with it, in a sense where you're like halfway going through it, but not really going through it, or were you starting to drink the figurative Kool-Aid, as you said? What's your background? Did you have more of a classic Christian background and could see, help me,
fill in the gap.
Untangle.
Yeah. I'll fill in the gaps. So, I grew up, born and raised in New Jersey, one of the youngest of 5 boys, raised in a wonderful Christian home. My parents are still alive, still together. I'm the only one in my family that did get divorced. All my other brothers are still happily married. So yes, grew up in a very typical, certainly not perfect, but what you would imagine of a wonderful, loving Christian home. had the gospel presented to me at a very early age, accepted the Lord or surrendered my life to the Lord, whatever you want to call that moment. When I was about 13, I do believe in calling an election. Maybe it was the moment that I realized this is what I needed in my life. So that was as a teenager. Did I fully live out my faith for all those years? Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. I'm not proud of that fact. It just proves that I am a sinful person in need of a perfect Savior. So I do believe that happened. So I always consider myself a Christian. And so the early years of the marriage with Uncle Robert, I went along to get along. And, you and I would not be having this conversation. I would have never written this book if it had not been for Paige. I loved my wife. And so I went along to get along. But I will tell you, Jim, one of the first moments where I really, really thought, holy smokes, this guy's a danger. And prior to this, I thought, he's really weird and I would love for him to go away. And the first few years of our marriage, he wasn't all encompassing like he was later on. But it would have been about a year after 9/11. And we were at another conference up in Idaho, and he started talking about how Roosevelt, FDR, was a Jew, and Truman was a Jew. He almost spit out the word. And now he was from Syria, born and raised, Uncle Robert. So when he came to America, he brought with him his prejudices and passions, and he was a raving anti-Semite. And I had no idea. And he said 80,000 people died on 9/11. And that was my first introduction to his anti-Semitism, which was really kind of the theological foundation for his ideology, which is, if you know your Bible, you go back to Genesis and you go back to the brothers, Jacob and Esau, right? And Jacob becomes greater Christendom and Esau becomes Edom, which becomes modern Jewry. And I at that point, I'd read the Bible a number of times, cover to cover. I still had to go back and kind of refresh my memory to all these stories. And so to Robert, Esau becomes Edom, which becomes modern Jewry. And so because of what Jacob did by stealing the birthright, all of recorded history, every recession, depression, war, you name it, is one big giant Jewish conspiracy to take over the world and dominate Christians. And I remember when I heard this, I thought, Paige, first of all, I can't believe you believe this. But number two, we should have nothing to do with this guy. I told her that night and I didn't follow through. She listened with a concerned look on her face and I never followed through. And so I wonder, if I had, that would have been what, 2001, 2002. Would she have left me then? Maybe, maybe not.
Well, before we hit the record button, we talked about Uncle Robert, this cult leader. Some of the words we used that you observed, that you experienced, was he was charismatic. He was obviously narcissistic. He's one of the guys that he made the rules. Kind of a gatekeeper to God, or a gatekeeper to heaven, or a gatekeeper to eternity, or whatever. And you also mentioned, as we've been talking, that Paige and what seems to be the rest of the family needed his permission to really do anything of significance. And I'm not trying to be rude or mean, and I do get this idea of you went along to get along, but you also said that you sat in a semicircle. I'm just trying to imagine it, Peter. You sat in a semicircle. This guy who's 5'6" from Syria is spewing stuff for hours and hours. Did it make any sense? Did it? I mean, and what was he talking about besides this great Jewish conspiracy?
Sure. So, as weird as you have pictured it in your mind, I can guarantee you, Jim, it's weirder. Okay. Okay. I will give you some little snippets. He was controlling and manipulative to the point that all the men, we were taught to sit down to pee. We couldn't stand to pee. He would have intimate conversations with my wife about, what is proper and what's not proper intimacy within a marriage, which, he was married himself. He should not have been having these phone calls, discussions with my wife. He considered casinos the true churches in America, and all the churches that you and I go to on a Sunday are worthless because only he knows the true gospel. So in addition to casinos being the true churches in America, he also called casinos his office, because the entire time I knew him, he never had a job. And he would go to the casino and gamble and supposedly use the money to support his ministry, whatever that was. And oh, by the way, he never had a job. And we all, over the years, tithed to him. I would tithe to organizations like Fellowship for Christian Athletes, Prison Fellowship, you name it. Eventually, it all went to Uncle Robert. So he was certainly not getting rich off of us, but we were sending all our tithe money to him. He calls the casinos his office. He also would talk endlessly about his interpretation of the scriptures. The fall of Adam and Eve was when they had sex, and all kinds of stuff. Now, it's really crazy. But I will say this. Cult leaders do not gather followers by instantly spouting utter nonsense and lies, right? Like, be crazy, right? Like, this guy's a nutcase. Why am I even here? They start by sounding really good. They start by sharing the truth. It's exactly what Robert did. There was much of what Robert shared. Early on, I thought, well, I was kind of hesitant, resistant, sounded new. But some of it, even to this day, I'd say, he's right. It wasn't him. He just happened to share it with me. But the analogy I give, Jim, and this is key for your audience to understand this, would be like a golf ball. Okay, if you miss-hit a golf ball by just that much, which I do all the time, or worse, 100 yards down the fairway, the ball is way off to the left, way off to the right, nowhere near where you wanted it to go or where it's supposed to be. Well, Uncle Robert, to continue the analogy, would tee up the right golf ball. He would read the Bible. And he knew the Bible inside and out, and he could quote it. But then he had a unique and perverse ability to take each and every verse and twist it. So that 5, 10, 15 years down the road, we were nowhere near the gospel on many issues, on many levels. And that's what cult leaders do. And so, people say, well, how did this happen to you? We go, well, how did you let this happen? And I'm sure in the back of their mind, people are always saying it would never happen to me. And I said the same thing, and it's okay. But I do know that it could happen to anybody. And for me, the circumstance was it took years. And if it hadn't been for my wife, it never would have happened. But I think people, get sucked into cults in a myriad of ways. And I, resisted and resisted, thought the guy was crazy, and then slowly but surely came around on certain ideas, and finally just got worn out and beaten down. I was just struggling, Jim, with the cognitive dissonance of loving and adoring this woman who loved and adored another man and thought this man brilliant. And I thought, well, this guy's not going away. I would rather have, this guru or mentor in our lives that's not crazy. I would rather have this guy, if he's going to be around, be smart. So I really tried to listen and find what it was that Paige and her parents saw in him. And I sort of did for about 2.5 years. I would have been brainwashed for about 2.5 years. But I never, when I say never, I mean never was comfortable around him. There was not one time where I had a phone call, and I started calling him all the time as well, or was in his presence where I was fully comfortable, because I never knew what he was going to say or do next.
Wow. That's all I can say, just wow. Did Uncle Robert, was he organized? Did he have a 501c3? So you're literally writing checks to him.
Oh yeah, no, we would just either cash or send checks to him. And I don't, did he gamble the money? I don't know, maybe not. His wife had a good job. So, the famous, he would always these little famous stories that when he would tell us, with like a hush over the room, this like the word of God almost. And when he was, I guess, courting his wife, he told her that he, Robert, could be her mission field, which translated means you work and make the money and I'll live off of you, because that's exactly what they did. She had a job at a hospital as a nurse. She made good money. And he went around to casinos or talked to us on the phone for hours, or would travel to D.C. This is where the grandiose sense of self comes in of all cult leaders, which Robert had. And he told us he had conversations with senators and representatives and Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Fed. And he would share, whatever it was he was sharing, which was, I don't know, watch out for Jews, who knows what. Before Gulf War II, he supposedly wrote Saddam Hussein a letter and then chided Saddam Hussein for not listening to him, because if he had listened, Saddam would have avoided his fate, on and on and on. So I guess,
he still at it? Is he still at it today?
I don't know. So, there's like a 7-year, we haven't gotten to the story it's kind of hard to get through. It's really intense and difficult and horrible. I have not talked to him in, 2018. So it's been 6 years. I have not talked to him at all, had no interaction with him whatsoever. I, kind of kicked him out of my life. I would imagine he's still alive. It'd be late 70s, early 80s, because there's been no change in my ex-wife or my in-laws that I've seen. And I feel like, when he does die, that, maybe there would be hope for them that they would change. But in terms of like, you said, is he organized? Does he have a church? None of that. There were no other families. It was a very small cult. And we hid him. We were not out on the street corners proselytizing, trying to gain other followers. I can't say that word very well. We were not out preaching him, sharing his sublime message. We hid him. And that's one of the ways cults maintain control over their members, is through secrecy, paranoia, and isolation. So the paranoia is, well, he knows about the Jews, right? So his life is in danger, so we're in danger. And the secrecy is, well, he's got this crazy theory and many others. So we can't share with others because we'd be throwing our pearls before the swine, right? So we kept it inside. So it was secretive, and we're paranoid. And so now we're isolated. We would leave church after church after church. We would go to a church. Paige would call Uncle Robert. Here's what the pastor said. Give it a year or two, and we would finally leave. Till we just stopped going to church altogether, and we would have home church near the end of our marriage.
Yeah. Once you get something in your head, you start seeing what you want to see. You start, believing what you want to believe. So I'm kind of getting this mind control idea, but and this is such a tragic story, Peter, where your love for this woman, you wanted to be a broadcaster, which is a form of journalism, and you seem extremely intelligent, and it does remind me of somebody I ran into when I was a kid. I was 18, and to make a long story short, he told enough truths, and he demonstrated enough color, if you will. For example, he was a black belt in karate. And he seemed to demonstrate that. He seemed to have some evidences of that. I couldn't completely validate it. He could play the guitar pretty well, had a pretty good voice. He's pretty intelligent, but everything else he said was a lie, and it came out, later. And being a young man who was extremely ambitious myself, connecting to that kind of a charismatic personality, was, I can see that part. I can see how that can happen. And frankly, as a father and a grandfather, it has always concerned me about who my kids, are with and who they're listening to, and really the culture, even just our culture, today, and the messages, of our culture.
Well, Jim, if I may, the way I would describe your friend that you just told that story about, and the way I would describe Uncle Robert, is also a biblical idea, and that is that the wolf doesn't get close to the sheepfold. You and I can spot the wolf. It's the wolf in sheep's clothing that does. It's the one that twists the truth just enough to cover his tracks. And that's exactly what Uncle Robert was, the wolf in sheep's clothing.
So did Uncle Robert have any kind of outward success that would we might call fruit, that would give some credence, so some integrity to what he was dishing out, or was this strictly truly mind control? And when you look at, and I know you weren't involved in it from the very beginning, but where did he get his hooks into this family?
Sure. So let's go back to the beginning. Robert would have left at some point Syria as a young adult, came to America, married a fairly normal looking and sounding woman from Tennessee. He goes to a seminary in Fresno, California, late 60s, early 70s, meets Paige's parents. Now, Paige's parents would have been ripe for someone like Robert, right? Like, he was not the cause of all their troubles, but much of them. So they had this very unhealthy, kind of sick, one-way relationship from the get-go. It was Uncle Robert's word and no one else's. And so, then fast forward.
Were they somewhat young? Were they somewhat young at that time?
Oh, yeah. Also, these Robert and Paige's parents would have been in their 20s. Yeah. probably late 20s.
Okay. All right.
And so this is early 70s. So then, Paige is born 72. And so now, 25 years later, here I come onto the scene. In terms of success, again, I've never seen Uncle Robert with a job. I don't think I ever saw him actually do any kind of physical or manual labor, ever. I never saw him work. He had no church following that I know of. Again, his wife made all the money. And then when you talk about fruit in terms of the evidence of what's really inside of a person, the Bible has a great chapter on it, Galatians chapter 5, where it talks about the fruit of the Spirit. There's 9 of them: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And most Christians know that. But before that, it talks about the evidence of the sinful nature, right? It's kind of the contrast, black and white. And it is factions, dissensions, hatred. And all of those were manifest greatly in Robert's life. He taught all of us to hate with a passion. He used to say, you need to love what Jesus loved and hate what Jesus hated. And with the emphasis on hate. I mean, he taught Paige and her parents and my kids and me to hate like you wouldn't believe. And we were very self-righteous, sanctimonious, because we knew the true gospel. So we thrived on dissensions and factions. We were different than all the other Christians. They were following the false gospel. Only we knew the true gospel. So all of those acts of the sinful nature, well, not all of them, but the majority of them, I believe, were readily apparent in his life.
So, in other words, he had the business of reframing who Jesus was and Jesus is.
Yes, and he did. Okay. And another example of maybe it's not so much reframing who Jesus was, but who he was in his relationship with Jesus. As we know, Jesus led a sinful life, right? That's why his death on the cross matters, could do something, because he was innocent.
A sinless life.
A sinless life, sorry. Yes, sinless life. He did not sin. And so Robert would tell the story of when he was a child, growing up in Syria. His dad gave him a slingshot and gave him rules on how to use it. And one time he disobeyed, and he, wound it up through the rock over a rise, and up over the rise at the last second appears a lamb. The rock hits the lamb and kills it. And that was the one time he disobeyed his father. And he would tell the story like it was the one time in his life he sinned, right? So Christ was sinless, and Robert only sinned once.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so let's talk about you for a minute, Peter. This story is your story, and it was significant in destroying your marriage and your family. I know it's a little painful to talk about that, but how did that? You said you've been cut off now for about 6 years from Uncle Robert, but what was the destruction of your family like practically? Who are you today? How has this changed you? Who am I talking to today?
Sure. Well, you are talking to someone that has been changed profoundly, who is 1,000,000 times stronger than he was. Over and over in the Bible, Christ says, don't fear, don't doubt, don't have fear, trust me, don't fear. But when I was under the most direct tutelage, spending the most time under Robert Booty, I was afraid of my shadow. I experienced more doubt and fear in those 2 to 3 years than the rest of my life combined. And that's not an accident. Cult leaders do that on purpose. So I have learned wonderful lessons. I wish I could have learned them differently because they were incredibly painful. Because in 2017, Paige left me, and there was never any kind of abuse. There was never any marital infidelity on either of our parts. I loved the woman, but I was never pure enough. She doubted my faith. I asked too many questions of Uncle Robert, never devoted enough, and that wasn't good enough for her. So she basically left me to draw closer to him. And then shortly thereafter, she started teaching our 5 children that I was a fraud, never really a Christian, because in her mind, I was a faithful husband. How could she biblically justify, leaving the marriage? She couldn't. So then she had to come up with something else, which Uncle Robert helped her, which was, well, Peter was never a Christian. So then she started telling the kids that I was a fraud, I was a demon, a devil, Satan, sorcerer, liar, abuser, coward, alien, you name it. And she told all the kids this. So it got really ugly really fast. And I had at that point been isolated, still brainwashed. Nobody in my family knew. So my parents didn't know, my brothers, my sister-in-laws, cousins, no one in Montana knew what was going on. It was all on my own shoulders. I lost 30 pounds. I couldn't sleep. I was a wreck, never suicidal. But I was a wreck. I finally reached out to friends and family, and they immediately rallied around me, immediately saw the danger of Robert. I still didn't at the time. I thought he was the answer to my problems when he was the source of almost all of it. And so then my access to the kids kind of got slowly cut off because, I was so demonic and evil. And, I raised my voice at Paige twice in our entire marriage. And once was after she had left me. And that was it. And so then about a year, less than a year later, she asked for a divorce. I was
Peter, what were the ages of your kids in 2017?
Let's see. So the oldest would have been 18, and then let's see, 16. Well, the youngest would have been 5, and then 9, and then 11. So pretty young. So the oldest had just graduated high school, one in high school. Then the younger 3 went with Paige to Idaho. She took them with her. The 2 oldest stayed with me. They supported their mom 100%, believed her. Didn't really talk to me much. When they did, it was not nice. So she filed for divorce. I'd finally, started to see the danger of Robert, started to realize he's a problem. He got lawyers involved. We got the courts involved. We had a garden ad litem. She did a jaw-dropping 50-page report that showed that, Robert was a cult leader. Cults are abusive to kids. It's not just my opinion. And that Paige and Robert had engaged in the worst case of parental alienation they'd ever seen, which is where one spouse, demeans the kids to the other. So then the courts sent the 3 youngest back to me. And that was in June of 2018. And so they lived with me for 5 years. The 2 youngest still live with me. We did eventually get divorced, but, it was a really, really hard, 2 years there. But I recovered. I mean, again, the beauty of it is I recovered.
Yeah. So at some point, all 5 were living with you?
No. So the 2 oldest were living with me almost for a full year after she left. And then, again, it got so bad. We didn't have the garden ad litem yet that they, they said to me, you're a devil with no soul. You need to sign, mom's divorce request or plea, or else we're going to, leave you, have nothing to do with you, and change our last names. And I didn't agree to it.
So they bought this all too.
Oh,
They and so they were affected directly or indirectly by, what would you say, directly or indirectly by Uncle Robert?
Oh, directly. All 5 kids did. I remember
What's that look like? What's the family situation today? What does it look like today?
Well, it's a work in progress. I always say that parenting's a marathon, not a sprint. The 2 youngest certainly get it. They still live with me. They understand the danger and threat and the fraud and the evil of Robert. They still love their mom, as they should. The 2 oldest boys, I don't see them much. I don't really think they believe what Robert is selling. They've really kind of drifted from their faith as far as I can tell, and it's hard to blame them with what they went through. Then the middle daughter, that's she now lives with her mom. That's a very difficult story to talk about. So there are a lot of moving parts. Our family has certainly been split up. I don't really ever see Paige. Things are still working its way through the courts. So it's a mess. It's still a mess.
So to say that you had to find your way back into a significant relationship and dependence on Christ, your faith, is probably an understatement to keep your sanity and dealing with, your own flesh and blood being ripped. Is Paige and Robert still in contact today, as far as you know?
As far as I know. So remember, cult leaders and cult members really gravitate towards the isolation, secrecy, and paranoia. So, Paige does not share anything with me. Everything is secretive. I never hear from her parents or Robert. It's all guarded with a very jealous, secretive eye towards not letting me know anything.
So to a lot of our listeners, they might say, God, this is the strangest thing I've ever heard, other than the Jim Jones, stories and such, or the evangelists on TV who manipulate and, blah, blah,
Right.
blah. And gives more credence to, I don't need to be involved in organized religion. And it just gets out of control from there, right? All the emotions, the feelings become facts.
Right.
And nobody backs up their intellect to take a broader picture and look at things. How much do you think this actually goes on? Is this like, it sounds kind of isolated to me. I don't, we hear about Waco, we hear about, all those kinds of things, but you don't hear about this kind of thing too much. Well, I doubt that you've done research on it. Maybe you have. I don't know. Maybe it's the last thing you want to do research on. I have no clue. But what do you think? Is this something that, we have a dude from Syria who goes to a Christian seminary. That in itself throws up question marks in my head, and what is this seminary? And, it's just, this all just sounds so, accreditation for Christian schools and seminaries has always brought down certain kinds of condemnation and judgment, because of the academic requirements versus, what you're trying to get done in seminary. But at the same time, those academic requirements might help from these weird things, happening. I don't know if you know the name of the seminary, but I'm sure that seminary probably doesn't want to be advertised as the seminary that put Robert out in the streets, to do the damage that he's done. I'm protesting here, right? I'm going, what in the heck? But it did help me a little bit when we backed up the story to say, okay, wait, all these people were in their 20s, when this probably began to take root. The seeds were planted. But, just that whole part of the story, which we didn't get into, Syria comes to America, goes to a Christian so-called seminary. What the heck? That's just a weird thing in and of itself. So, I'm thinking there's some strange stuff that was in flight, over here. But anyway, back to the question. What do you think? Is this really an odd, strange thing, or is this more prevalent than I believe?
Well, I think it's both. It's certainly odd and strange, as your listeners now know. I think it's probably more prevalent than we know. I don't know the exact figures. I've heard numbers in terms of the amount of cults in America and in the state of Montana, the numbers in the thousands. I remember during my recovery, now to remind you, I was brainwashed for about 2.5 years. Fully in. And it took a year to recover, a good solid year to finally really have the Lord open my eyes and ears to see that Robert was the danger and was a false teacher. Someone during that time sent me a book anonymously by a guy named Dr. Stephen Hassan. He's kind of the cult expert in America, one of probably many. Written a couple of books. It was called Combating Cult Mind Control. And I remember thinking, oh, come on, it wasn't a cult. It was bad. Uncle Robert was weird and it was bad, but it wasn't a cult. Finally read the book and I ended up highlighting and underlining like half of it. And I'm like, you know what? It was a cult. Like I couldn't ignore it. I didn't want to admit it, but it was. Who wants to admit they're in a cult, right? So,
right.
So I always say you never know you are in a cult. You only know you were in one, because again, it's all about undue mind control. When you're in a cult, it's not a cult. It's something better. It's something different, more enlightened. No one ever joins a cult. They only know it once they get out. So I knew it when I got out. I also say this, Jim. I think there's a difference between a true cult and dysfunctional, dangerous, unhealthy culture, right? There's a difference between, like some people try and call it the cult of Trump. I disagree. I think there can be certain groups, organizations, even churches, whatever it is, who have a very unhealthy culture. I don't think that necessarily makes them a cult. So then to answer the question directly, is it more prevalent? I think so. I look at my situation. When I finally told people at my office I sell real estate, 9 months after Paige left, and I had lost 30 pounds, I would show up with red puffy eyes from bawling my eyes out and never wanted to let anybody see it. I couldn't sit still on my desk. I'd go for walks for hours around town. And I finally told them, because I wanted them to know rather than hear it for gossip, what was happening in my life. No one knew. And I take such a great lesson from that moment, and that is the guy that cuts you off on the highway, the rude grocery clerk, or the rude neighbor. You never know what they're going through at that moment in time. So instead of reacting in kind, be kind, because all of us either have gone through something difficult, will at one time, or are right now.
Okay, so we're at a good spot here. In a minute, I'm going to give you put you behind the wheel to talk in this podcast by talking a little bit about your writings and how people can learn more, purchase your books, etc. But before we do that, if I could, let me just do some high level education. Particularly for those of you who are listening and you would call yourself a Christian. I know that not every one of our listeners would call themselves a Christian, and that's okay. But I think what I'm about to say will be helpful to kind of get a bigger picture here. First of all, Christians, if we speak in the term of orthodoxy, meaning that there's been a lot of years, a lot of people who iron sharpening iron, strong tradition, all of those kinds of things. As Christians, we embrace a high view of Scripture. So with that said, there are a lot of smart people to what Peter's been talking about who can twist Scripture. And so when you have somebody who can twist Scripture and you still have a high view of Scripture, having a high view of Scripture doesn't mean you necessarily understand it or that you understand systematic theology, where the Bible interprets the Bible is what I'm talking about. But as Christians, we have a high view of Scripture. With that said, those of us who are listening today, do we understand and navigate the difference between these things: world religions, false doctrines, and cults? If we were to say the plumb line is Orthodox Christianity, obviously coming from a Christian worldview, we would say there is a plumb line called Orthodox Christianity. There are Christian branches that you could say, and I would liberally, and I mean that liberally, I mean that, let me restate that. When I say there are Christian branches, I'm being liberal and gracious in my definition. In doing so, we would say that there's Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholicism, and Protestantism in its many denominations. Now, I'm already creating a world of argument because some will argue whether certain things about Eastern Orthodoxy, certain things about Roman Catholicism, and certainly who gets included into Protestantism when it comes to denominations. Then there is the realm of world religions, which the broad scope would be Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. Buddhism coming out of Hinduism. And then there are the more well-recognized organizations. And this is where, Peter, you may not want to be included in this conversation. I don't know, and you don't need to comment on this. We'll come back to you in a minute. But from Orthodox Christian perspective, cults that are much larger than what Peter's been involved in would be like Unitarianism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Science, and dare I say, Mormonism. So those are things that you don't need to get angry with me if you disagree. But I would just encourage you that if you are very casual in your view of religion, maybe that's dangerous. Maybe you might want to consider studying some of these things, and they're not hard to find. So I just wanted to kind of recap, so what Peter has talked about today. A cult isn't just these small things that you will find here and there. Look at what it did to Peter's family and to Peter's life. And when you are part of something that, we all have a responsibility, I guess is what I'm saying, to understand what we think we believe. And I'm always amazed when I get involved in a conversation with somebody from any of those things that I just mentioned, even Orthodox Christianity, and I ask them what they believe. They really don't know what they believe. So if that's you, and I'm not trying to be Mr. Theologian on anyone, I'm just trying to say, isn't this conversation with Peter enough to make us say, maybe we need to take a step back and look at, what we believe. Peter, how can we learn more about your writings and what you're doing? And we know you have a day job in real estate, but you obviously had a desire to compete at a high level.
Mm-hmm.
You had a desire to be a coach at a high level, and you had a desire to be a journalist at a high level. So those things make sense to me. And how it's kind of come full circle, in you putting pen to paper. So talk to us a little bit about that before we say goodbye.
Sure. I tell people, I'm done with the days of trying to be the next Larry Bird. So I'm not trying to be the next John Steinbeck or Ernest Hemingway because I write. I'm just trying to be the best Peter Young, right? That's why God created us. So
good.
This is my Amazon best-selling memoir, Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger. It came out last year. You can find it on Amazon, as well as my first novel, The Blue Team. And the sequel to The Blue Team will be coming out this year in 2024. Again, The Blue Team about faith in basketball and identifying your greatest adversary, which is really your mind. And you can also go to my website to read more about my books and also my speaking. And again, I go on these podcasts not just to promote my book, Jim, but to share my story as a cautionary tale that, listen, it could happen to anybody. And then number two, just real quick, the idea of, well, how do you prevent happening what happened to me to somebody else? And the key is staying in fellowship and communication with your fellow believers. And so if somebody stops showing up to, whether it's Bible study, book club, or Friday night bowling, reach out, stay in communication, right? Don't let that person become isolated, because when they're isolated, then they're vulnerable. That's the key. Stay in fellowship and communication with others. And my website is authorpeteryoung.com. I don't know if I said it, but that's my website.
Authorpeteryoung.com is your website, and you've got 2 books already out, another one coming. Peter, thank you for sharing your story. Obviously, from one man to another, I'm sorry about what you have experienced, and there is a but in our faith, and that what has happened can be transformed in and through you to help others. And so I appreciate you taking the time today to be on our podcast.
Yeah, you bet. Romans 8:28, right? So he can work out all things for his good. And thanks for having me on, Jim.
If you're not part of the Lead Today community, let me invite you. Go to leadtodaycommunity.com. That's leadtodaycommunity.com and sign up for Monday Moments. It's a weekly email that will encourage your leadership. Again, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for telling a friend about the Today Counts show.